Good evening. This is Margaret Menge with Crossroads Report. I wanted to hop on here tonight to talk about the situation with the war in Ukraine and to talk with a good friend of mine, Rob Brantley, who has a fascinating background and so many insights on national security policy, foreign policy, and I just knew that he had so much to say about this issue. Rob Brantley is a policy analyst and consultant who's had a long history in public affairs. He was a former attorney with the Federal Communications Commission, former Capitol Hill staffer, also was with the U.S. Department of Labor, and with a Wall Street regulatory firm. And I should mention, because it's really interesting, he was with Project 2025 with 4 different teams: the Office of Personnel Management team, the State Department team, the Commerce Department team, and the Treasury Department team. So he has a wealth of experience. And Rob, I want to say welcome. You and I usually are on emails, exchanging emails with a couple of other friends on a lot of these topics: the war in Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Gaza. And I think this is the first time that we've actually seen each other in person. So it's great to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you, and appreciate your having me.
Yeah, no, I'm delighted. And I know that you have strong opinions. I have strong opinions. Once in a while we clash. We agree on a lot. But I'm so interested to hear what your reaction was to what happened on Friday, where Volodymyr Zelensky is in the Oval Office with Trump, and they have this, what do we want to call it? It was a not exactly a blow up, but this, what was intended to be this talk to reach a peace agreement or a ceasefire, the minerals agreement, disintegrated into chaos, with Trump really handing it to Zelensky in front of the whole world. What was your reaction to everything that happened on Friday morning in the Oval Office, and what do you think the fallout is? What does it really mean for the U.S. and Europe?
Well, my reaction would be that Zelensky's attitude, seems to be one of entitlement. That he expects the U.S. To come to their aid and bail them out. And then, what happened with the Biden regime, he expected that to continue with Trump, despite all the rhetoric and Trump's stated policies to be more or less the reverse. But I think what it's really more about is that Zelensky is not qualified to be a president of a country, a serious country. His background is certainly inconsistent with that, and he seems to have no diplomatic skills when the going gets rough. And so he comes into this meeting, he should be deferential. He's coming into the meeting hat in hand, so to speak, and he allows it to get out of control from his perspective. So, someone like Vance says something that irritates him. Well, a smart person in that position would, just hold his tongue and adapt. Adapt rhetorically to what your host and money spigot is saying. And instead, he can't control himself, and he's sitting there before the whole world, and he just lets it get out of control and alienates his sponsor, so to speak, and is very bizarre. And I would hope that Trump would see who he's dealing with now.
Well, yeah, and I think the whole world could see. And I think it's interesting that you said he's not really prepared to be a leader of a country, because I remember when I was studying Ukrainian a few years ago, it would have been 2021. I remember my Ukrainian professor talking about Zelensky and saying he he really doesn't know what he's doing. And this was before Russia invaded and before Ukraine was in the news constantly. And I just remember her saying he doesn't really know what he's doing. He doesn't really have any idea. He was an actor, right? I mean, he didn't come up through public affairs. He was an actor, a star of this TV show, and then all of a sudden was elevated to head of state. And I think, yeah, you saw sort of by his behavior in the Oval Office that he just, all he needed to do was bite his tongue and there would have been an agreement, and he just couldn't do it. And I think we have a clip that we were going to play showing really where things went off the rails in that Oval Office meeting. This was Friday morning.
Also as a force for good. And now I'm talking with my friends in Poland, and they are worried that you align yourself too much with Putin. What's your message for them?
Well, if I didn't align myself with both of them, you'd never have a deal. You want me to say really terrible things about Putin and then say, "Hi, Vladimir, how are we doing on the deal?" That doesn't work that way. I'm not aligned with Putin. I'm not aligned with anybody. I'm aligned with the United States of America and for the good of the world. I'm aligned with the world, and I want to get this thing over with. You see the hatred he's got for Putin. It's very tough for me to make a deal with that kind of hate. He's got tremendous hatred, and I understand that, but I can tell you the other side isn't exactly in love with, him either. So it's not a question of alignment. I'm aligned with the world. I want to get the thing set. I'm aligned with Europe. I want to see if we can get this thing done. You want me to be tough? I could be tougher than any human being you've ever seen. I'd be so tough, but you're never going to get a deal that way. So that's the way it goes. All right, one more question.
I will respond to this. So look, for 4 years in the United States of America, we had a president who stood up at press conferences and talked tough about Vladimir Putin, and then Putin invaded Ukraine and destroyed a significant chunk of the country. The path to peace and the path to prosperity is maybe engaging in diplomacy. We tried the pathway of Joe Biden of thumping our chest and pretending that the president of the United States' words mattered more than the president of the United States' actions. What makes America a good country is America engaging in diplomacy. That's what President Trump is doing.
Can I ask you?
Sure.
Yeah?
Here we go.
Okay. So he occupied our parts, big parts of Ukraine, part of East and Crimea. So he occupied it on 2014. So during a lot of years, so I'm not speaking about just Biden, but those time was Obama, then President Obama, then President Trump, then President Biden, now President Trump, and God bless, now President Trump will stop him. But during 2014, nobody stopped him. He just occupied and took. He killed people. You know what the contact
2015.
2014 and 2014.
2014.
Yeah. So
I was not here.
Yeah, but
That's exactly right.
Yes, but during 2014 till 2022, the situation the same. The people have been dying on the contact line. Nobody stopped him. You know that we had conversations with him, a lot of conversation, my bilateral conversation, and we signed with him. Me, like a new president, in 2019, I signed with him the deal. I signed with him, Macron and Merkel. We signed ceasefire. All of them told me that he will never go. We signed him with gas contract. Yes, but after that, he broken this ceasefire. He killed our people and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come to the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to.
Count one.
I've actually watched and seen the stories, and I know what happens is you bring them on a propaganda tour, Mr. President. Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly what
this.
you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very
you will
good.
Feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very
You
strong.
will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having
not playing cards.
Right now, you don't.
You're
playing cards. You're playing cards.
Serious.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
Please, you think that if you will speak very loudly about the war, you
He's
can...
not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly. Your country is in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No. You've done a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not winning. You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
You haven't been
in this
alone.
cabinet.
You
and
haven't
not
been
only
alone.
in this
We
cabinet.
gave you, through
I
this
said
stupid president, $350 billion.
You voted
We gave
for
you
your
military equipment,
You
and you
voted
men
for
are
your
brave,
president.
but they had to use our military.
What about West?
If you didn't have
You
our
invited
military
me.
equipment,
You invited
if
me
you
to
didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days. I heard it from Putin. In 3 days. This is something
Maybe
new.
less.
In 2 weeks. Of course, yes.
It's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this. I tell you.
Just say thank you.
I said a lot of times,
Accept that there are disagreements, and let's go litigate those disagreements rather than trying to fight it out in the American media when you're wrong. We know that you're wrong.
But you see, I think it's good for the American people to see what's going on.
I understand, sir.
I think it's very important. That's why I kept this going so long. You have to.
Wow, stunning,
have the
stunning, stunning. Every time I watch it, I get something more from it.
Yeah, it's somewhat painful to watch.
It's painful, but it's there's something clarifying about it too, I guess, because like Trump said, it allows everyone to actually see and hear for themselves what the situation is with this guy. I think I counted 8 different times he really sort of broke protocol. And the first one was where he addressed Vice President Vance as JD. It's very informal, and I guess it might be a language thing, or he heard Trump refer to JD Vance as JD, and so he repeated that JD. But of course, they're in the Oval Office, and this is the Vice President of the United States, and Vance was calling him Mr. President, and he was calling Vance JD.
Well, that shows a lack of experience with diplomatic protocol, and so it's another example of his, lack of background or preparation.
Yeah, exactly. And then interrupting and challenging the Vice President of the United States repeatedly, and then I think where it really went off the rails is where he came across with this veiled threat. You have a nice ocean. You don't feel it now, but you're gonna feel it, which is saying you're gonna get it. They're gonna give it to you too. You're gonna feel pain too. You're gonna get it. America. And I think that really sent Trump over the edge. He just wasn't going to tolerate that.
Yeah, and then what the crossing of the arms, that is sort of a subconscious psychological display of resistance and defiance. And
Sure.
I'm defending myself from your impertinent rhetoric.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then his eye movement was weird. So he seemed to be looking off. I don't know if he was bored, or didn't get a run in that morning, but he seemed real fidgety. And then he was kind of staring off in a weird part of the room, like a high corner of the room, as if he had someplace else to be. Like he didn't really want to be there. So that was odd. And then doing this to his nose, which has been remarked upon by others. So who knows? Maybe he's got a drug habit, maybe not. But some of these things were strange. It's not kind of how you expect a head of state to comport themselves.
Well, I think he had gotten detached from his handlers, and when left on his own devices, he didn't prove up to the moment.
Yeah, and then when he came in, saying to J.D. Vance, "Please, if you think you can speak loudly about the war," and then Trump jumped right on that too and said, "He's not speaking loudly. What are you talking about?" And then saying we've been alone in the war. We know, Rob, all of us who really studied this know there would be no war without the United States. We've had U.S. special forces all over Kiev, probably for decades, is what I've been told. I mean, since the 90s, that there are missiles. It's our guys training their guys. It's a war that we're basically waging using the Ukrainians. So wasn't that bizarre for him to say that we're alone? Ukraine is alone.
Yeah, but that's sort of negotiation positioning. You posit a position that is false, but for much of the audience, which is ignorant, it could be true. But the reality is, the U.S. had turned Ukraine into a client puppet state shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed. And beginning in the early to mid 90s, gradually over time, it's become really a client of the U.S. And in the early days, there wasn't much Russia could do about it. It was weak. And then, but the more recent revelations, for example, by Victoria Nuland, that the U.S. had built bioweapon plants in Ukraine,
right?
And that, as I understand it, the U.S. had planned to put missiles in Ukraine, aimed obviously at Russia. And there's many other things. I don't know if we will ever find out, the extent of the U.S.'s presence there, with CIA people and that type of thing. But Ukraine is not an independent actor and hasn't been really for 30 years. And then the 2014 thing, that's where it all starts. And probably the vast majority of Americans are unaware of that the U.S. led a coup against a democratically elected pro-Russian government in 2014, because the leader of that government decided the country's interests economically were more aligned with Russia than Europe. And that triggered something in the foreign policy establishment, interventionist blob, to the effect that we have got to do something about this. So Nuland and all of her minions, they conspired to create the so-called Maiden Revolution with lots of U.S. money, as usual. And so you had thousands of protesters. At that point, the president of Ukraine should have been a bit, tougher. but he felt the need to flee, and so there was a coup, more or less. And as a result, Putin felt the need to seize the Crimea, where their Black Sea fleet was based. And then there was always the shelling, the war, mini war, between Ukraine forces and the Russian speaking Ukrainians in southeast Ukraine. But that was the real start of it. And most people don't realize
that the war didn't start in 2022.
Exactly. Probably 90% of Americans are oblivious to that fact. And so, where we're at now, again, nobody talks about it much these days, but Putin and Zelensky were on the verge of an agreement prior to the U.S. and Boris Johnson of the U.K. meddling and encouraging Zelensky to not sign on to the agreement because we would, mainly the U.S., would be supporting them with endless aid, munitions, and that sort of thing. And so Zelensky is sort of a pawn. You can blame him, but the real malicious actors were Biden and Johnson, who was really more of a emissary for Biden. And it's really Biden and the State Department, led by Victoria Nuland, who once again, somebody should do a movie on her. It's just this evil villainess who comes out of the woodwork to commit mayhem on the world. And so, what happened? So Biden, instead of brokering a peace, he brokered a war.
Well, Anthony Blinken, we can say Anthony Blinken was a big part of that too. And Jake Sullivan is the national security advisor. Maybe Nuland, Blinken, and Jake Sullivan were sort of running that show with Ukraine. Is that safe to assume?
Well, sure. Yeah, they're all in it together. But, Nuland has been doing this sort of thing for a long time under administrations of both parties. She seems to be one of the key instigators of, worldwide destruction, if you will.
That's right.
Blinken, he was a nobody.
Came in more recently.
Yeah, he was a nobody before he became Secretary of State. And Sullivan, he had done his thing at think tanks, I guess, and that sort of thing, and had some national security experience. But so yeah, they're all in it together, of course. But to me, Nuland's the straw that stirs the drink.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of evidence of that. I was just looking up her background, and I just saw, I didn't realize she worked at the American Embassy in Moscow in 1992 and 93, and I was in Moscow in 1993, living there in 93, 94, and I think I was at the embassy a couple of times, and she would have been working there at the time, and she's about 10 years older than I am. But then she went on to become the spokesperson for the State Department, and then she was an emissary to NATO, and then became the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of European Affairs, and then I guess came back in that same capacity, if I'm not mistaken, under Biden, where she was. So she's been focused on Europe. You're right. Blinken wasn't in the picture 10, 15 years ago. Victoria Nuland was, because she had been a foreign service officer focused on U.S. policy towards Russia and Europe for more than 2 decades, actually probably going on 3 decades. And she's the wife of Robert Kagan, major neoconservative warmonger. And then I also saw Victoria Nuland was our U.S. representative in Europe, whose job was to muster European support for the war in Afghanistan. So she was right in the middle, and her husband Kagan was as well, with the wars in the Middle East following 9/11. She's run right in the center of it all.
Yeah, she's on the inside, doing orchestrating the government actions, and he's on the outside, but in the think tanks, or think tank. I think it was AEI all along, putting out the academic theses purporting to justify why the U.S. empire must remain predominant around the globe. And Kagan also has a brother and his wife, Frederick Kagan, and his wife. They're not quite as extreme as Kagan and Newland, but I call it the Kagan Combine. And these are some of the more extreme and belligerent of the neocons. There's lots of them, but it's sad to see how this particular element within the foreign policy establishment, broadly defined, can completely hijack our foreign policy.
And I watched what's happened with the folks who on the right who are driven by anti-communism, and so that's everyone, starting with Reagan, really up until the present, that the right was always characterized by this the fight against communism. We have to fight. Well, okay, I mean that's all well and great, but then the Cold War ended 30 years ago, and a lot of them didn't seem to realize that the folks we called the Ruskies are no longer the Bolsheviks and communists that we were fighting, and it's a totally different regime. And the Putin regime, say what you want, but Putin has rebuilt 25,000 Orthodox Christian churches across Russia, churches that were destroyed by the Bolsheviks, and he's allied very closely with the Russian Orthodox Church, and the government TV channel all across Russia. Every Sunday they air an entire church service. This would be like NPR, airing a church service, a Catholic church service or a Methodist church service every Sunday morning. They wouldn't do it, of course, but so these aren't we're not fighting communism anymore. But so many folks on the right they didn't get the memo that the Cold War had ended. Why do you think that is, Rob? You've been around and watched all of this.
Well, I believe the key is that first, you have to look at the conflicts of interest, and you have to follow the money. So that's a big part of it. What keeps the vested interest going? It's U.S. funding. Defense munitions for the what I call the merchants of death, the defense contractors, who in turn give the campaign contributions to members of Congress. Of course, they always fund presidential campaigns too. They also fund the think tanks. So what you have is virtually every think tank, every major think tank, mostly based in D.C., are neocon interventionist oriented. There's only a couple of exceptions.
And the biggest one I always see is the Institute for the Study of War is always quoted in every, New York Times, Washington Post is always quoting the Institute for the Study of War, and they never mention who funds them. And you can look it up and see they're funded by all of the big defense contractors. And so you think, well, gee, I wonder if they have a little conflict of interest there.
Right, exactly. Well, there's a couple of dozen of these think tanks. There's the major think tanks. American Enterprise Institute is one of the majors. It's always been a neocon-oriented think tank. Conservatives have looked at it more recently, in recent decades, as conservative-oriented, and a lot of policy matters it is, or has become. The others, the Brookings Institution and even Heritage, until more recently, were in on the foreign policy establishment thing. And so, getting back to your question, I believe, aside from the money and the conflicts that arise from that, it's an ideological thing. These people, many of these neocon interventionists, their roots or family roots are in Eastern Europe or in Russia. And those people, they have just a hatred for Russia that goes back. I mean, the czars, you know, they weren't the nicest people in the world, like a lot of autocrats, but there's this hatred that has descended from one generation to another, and they just seem to not be able to get over it, that the Cold War is over, the Soviet Union is over, Russia is not the Soviet Union, and Putin is not Stalin, but they can't accept that because this ideology is driving them, combined with the fact that they support what I call the U.S. empire. And there are some people that don't accept there's a U.S. empire, but I don't know how they can, when you look at the facts, how they can say that. It's a different type of empire than has existed in the past, but nonetheless, it's an empire. We have 250,000 troops in 170 countries. We have 800 military bases abroad, despite the fact that we haven't been at war with anybody since the Cold War.
No, I agree, it's nuts, but I don't know. You know, when I think of empire, I think of this large state that colonizes other parts of the world and extracts resources from them. And what I've noticed, I mean, the Iraq War, you know, we never took the oil. We left the oil behind, and now China is in Iraq and getting their oil. And I think, you know, I don't know if you could really say empire, because an empire would take advantage of lesser countries and extract resources and valuables from them. Isn't that right?
Well,
aren't we kind of dupes in a way?
I didn't say we were a competent empire.
Okay.
And as one of our email colleagues has noted, Britain, for all its faults, it had a well-run empire, and it knew how to do it. The U.S. does not know how to do it. So on the Iraq thing, which, you know, should have never happened, but if we were going to do it, why not get some oil out of it?
Exactly.
I mean, we paid the Iraqis the requisite royalty for the oil, but the last thing we should have allowed was for the Chinese to come in there and co-opt that. But what I'm getting at is more not that we would do this for resources, because we have our own resources and we can get resources through other means and other places. But it's about controlling countries with money. The amount of money that comes out of the U.S. is unprecedented. This goes back decades. I mean, trillions and trillions of dollars, if you go back far enough, in current dollars. The British never did that. They never put that kind of money behind their empire. So it's about controlling countries and people through other means. Part of it is military support or military alliances. We have alliances with 82 countries. Like, we're going to go to war to defend 82 countries. I mean, how preposterous is that?
Absolutely preposterous.
Yeah.
And how did we get to this point where we would enter into these alliances that would tie our hands? Well,
it started with end of World War II. Europe was completely dead, more or less. Much of the rest of the world was. So there was the Soviets and us. And so we became the leader of the free world, so to speak. And that was a bipolar world. And so you had the Cold War. And so both sides were vying for control over parts of most of the planet. And most of those people didn't care either way. All they wanted was, how much money can we get from these idiots? The U.S. or Russia? Who's going to give us the most money? That's the main thing they cared about. They were not necessarily Marxist, but they weren't necessarily pro-freedom American Western types either. They didn't care. They wanted just to milk us for what we could get. So then the Soviet Union collapses, and they are dead in the water. China is a non-entity at that point. So there's the unipolar moment. The U.S. is the king of the mountain, and instead of being magnanimous in our victory, the Clinton regime decided to double down on the victory, if you will, and taking advantage of Russia being weak, and then started expanding NATO. And George Kennan acknowledged that was an unwise move. And over time, of course, I mean, from the beginning, it alienated Russia, rightfully so. Russia felt that it's being it's under assault, and it was. How else can you consider that? So NATO then, evolved or devolved from being a defensive alliance to an offensive alliance. It kept expanding up to Russia's doorsteps, and that just developed alienation within Russia. And I don't know how people can say that enhances security to add these Eastern European countries to NATO. In my view, that undermines security because it creates destabilization. And
it was ridiculous. Yeah.
That is what the U.S. has been doing for 30 years. We've been creating destabilization throughout the world with our provocative actions. And so history shows when there's a unipolar moment, one country dominating the world or whatever the part of the world is considered civilized, then other countries over time, they resent that, and it's an untenable situation. And so that unipolar moment will not last long. And in our case, it lasted maybe 25 or 30 years at the most. And so now it's over. The foreign policy establishment won't accept that. They still act as if we're the king of the mountain and we dominate the world. But in fact, we don't. The U.S. is really declining power relative to the rest of the world financially and in other ways. We have $36 trillion of debt, which in itself is an existential threat. Nobody wants to acknowledge that. I think that's a much bigger threat than China is, because it's here. We're dealing with it every day. And all that debt crowds out private investment. And now we're on the verge of paying $1 trillion a year in debt interest payments. The entire federal budget was $1 trillion in 1990. And it's not a sustainable situation. And so then the whole Ukraine thing pops up, and okay, why would people think it's our job to protect Ukraine? We didn't have an alliance with Ukraine. Ukraine was not in NATO. Why is it our job to do that? And it goes back to the U.S. as world policeman. The U.S. is world policeman, and that you can't do that without an empire. The British were the world's policemen for 250 years. They did it as part of their empire. And a lot of that was financial. They had the financial situation where they got resources and that type of thing. And in our case, it's more about buying into the argument that, well, we have to dominate the world to keep it safe.
And the American people were sold on this idea that it's a Cold War era struggle of these wonderful people against communist tyranny, that we have to help the Ukrainians because they're battling this terrible kind of pseudo-communist country called Russia. And Americans were very familiar with this whole idea because we had all these Cold War movies, but not realizing that this wasn't really the situation at all. And Jeffrey Sachs, in this address he just gave to the EU Parliament on February 24th, talked about this Ukraine war is actually a 30-year project of the West, 30-year project to provoke Russia and bring it to war. And we got it. We got the war that we wanted.
Well.
Oh, yeah. And I think we're going to see a little clip of Jeffrey Sachs, February 24th, speaking to the EU Parliament.
Soviet Union ended in 1991. The United States literally believed this is now a U.S. world, and we will do as we want. The wars in the Middle East, Serbia, the wars in Africa, these are wars that the United States led and caused. And this has been true for more than 40 years. Europe has not had any foreign policy during this period that I can figure out. No voice, no unity, no clarity, only American loyalty. Please don't have American officials as head of Europe. Have European officials. Have a European foreign policy. You're going to be living with Russia for a long time, so please negotiate with Russia. Trump and President Putin will agree to end the war. If Europe does all its great warmongering, it doesn't matter. The war is ending. Not one word is told to the American people about anything, or to you, or by any of your newspapers these days. This idea that Putin's reconstructing the Russian Empire, this is childish propaganda. So the war started. What was Putin's intention in the war? I can tell you what his intention was.
Hi, Clint Kuhns here with Anderson Business Advisors, and I would
Europe has no foreign policy. The war is over. It doesn't matter what Europe does. It's over. He's saying Europe needs to have its own foreign policy that is not just anti-Russia. It needs to be an actual coherent foreign policy that involves a relationship with Russia. Is that going to happen? Do you think, Rob? Is that where this is? Is that where we're going? Is Europe going to emerge as its own sort of force, come out from under the wing of the United States?
Well, I hate to say it, but again, the foreign policy establishment doesn't like to hear this, but even Europe is essentially a pawn of the U.S. What else can you say when the U.S. funds 67% of NATO, when the vast majority of the European countries, especially the leading countries, don't even spend 2% of their own GDP on defense?
Right.
And the U.S. foreign policy establishment does not want an independent Europe. They're on record as saying we do not want you to be independent because we want you to.
But why?
Well, because they want to control Europe and control the entire debate. If Europe is independent of the U.S., that means by definition it's going to become more aligned toward Russia, because that's the natural order of things. Russia is there, we're here. For example, Russia and Germany have had a commercial relationship for 400 years.
Right.
Okay, Germany's interests have always been aligned with Russia as opposed to the United States. In fact, the U.S. and Germany have never had a substantive relationship. What happened after World War II was you had a situation where the country was, again, like Japan, it was just totally dead in the water. It had no choice but to do what the U.S. told them to do. We occupied it for 10 years. So since then, they've been denuded as a society, more or less, including militarily. They have virtually no military today. The ideologues in the U.S. foreign policy establishment do not want an independent Europe. They have resisted what Macron of France has enunciated, and to his credit, he sees the light on the fact that Europe needs to be independent and assert more autonomy so that it can make its own decisions vis-a-vis its perceived interest. It can't do that as long as it's a pawn of the U.S. As long as they remain in NATO exists as it is, the U.S. will call the shots because we're paying the bill. And so Europe will never leave the nest within the context of NATO. That is why, for our reasons, our purposes and interests, but also for Europe's, why Trump should withdraw from NATO, as he said. And he was right in 2016. NATO is obsolete.
And is that where we're going? Is that going to happen?
I believe so.
I see all of a sudden that idea becoming mainstream. Who was it? It wasn't Lindsey Graham. It was, I just saw somewhere, someone prominent was calling for U.S. withdrawal from NATO. And it was kind of like, oh, wow. When Trump first said it in 2015, they said he was crazy.
That was Elon Musk. He had a headline.
Okay. I remember when Trump first said it, and when he was running in 2015, he said we should get out of NATO. We don't need it anymore. We're not in the Cold War. Cold War is long over. And people went nuts in DC and they said he's crazy. And now all of a sudden it seems like people are really talking about it. Is that going to happen? You think?
I think it will happen. It's like everything else in the world these days. It takes forever for the right thing to happen. It's a problem with Western society. It takes us forever to develop anything. To create a major infrastructure project takes decades, when we used to do it in a couple or a few years. But in this case, I think it will happen because NATO's raison d'etre has been achieved. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union was defeated. It should have gone. It should have. The U.S. should have withdrawn in the mid-90s by 1995 at the latest, and NATO could become UTO, the European Treaty Organization, and then they can do their own thing. If they feel threatened by Russia, then they can do what they need to do, spend what they need to do to protect against that perceived threat.
So this is Utah. You're saying UTO.
UTO. I call it UTO. That's my own construction.
See, in Europe, I think they would say UTO. They say UTO.
Okay.
They say NATO instead of NATO. They say NATO. So
well, anyway, it goes from NATO to EUTO.
Okay. UTO.
Or they can call it whatever they want to call it. But they should be, they collectively, they have more people than the U.S. Collectively, they have a larger GDP than the U.S. And it is absurd that 34 years after the Cold War, we are still taking care of them. I mean, it's like something from Kafka, and the American people have been just fleeced on this European thing. So they spend virtually nothing on their own defense. And so that gives them, hundreds of billions a year to subsidize their industry to the detriment of our industry.
To subsidize college tuition.
Hundreds of billions a year for their
Europeans don't pay to go to college.
Right, their domestic welfare, you name it. But they wouldn't be able to do that if they had to spend hundreds of billions a year collectively.
No, they wouldn't.
On their own defense. And so it's in our interest to pull out. There's no threat there. Russia is not a threat to Western Europe. That's just preposterous. Or Europe as a whole, other than perhaps the Baltics. But so they're under the spell, if you will, that Russia is this terrible monster that's going to gobble us up if the U.S. is not around and so forth. And so I think it will happen. Also, the so-called pivot to Asia, regardless of what one thinks of that, there is no way the U.S. can shift priorities there as long as it's part of NATO, because the U.S. is not what it used to be in terms of 1960 or 1970. In short, we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. The U.S.
We just don't have enough money, or we don't have enough ships, or what?
Does not have the capabilities broadly defined to be substantively involved or integrated in Europe in a military way while trying to shift, make a huge commitment to Asia. So what should happen is we should withdraw from NATO, let the Europeans run it. The organization will still exist. It would simply be a European organization. And then we should revive CETA, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was an Asian version of NATO. It collapsed, I believe, in the late 70s. And if there were people want to deal with China in an organized way, that's the best way to do it. But it should not be based on the NATO model where the U.S. dominates it and funds 67% of it. It should be more like we're just a member. We lend our prestige, our military know-how, but we should fund no more than 10% of it. And you let these countries in Asia affected by China, however, to whatever degree, Japan, South Korea, India, and so forth, they join up and they are the major presence. The U.S. would be sort of the glue that holds it together, maybe, and again, prestige and so forth. And I think that's the best way to do it, to the extent one thinks that the U.S. should be involved in Asia vis-a-vis China.
No, that's really interesting. Well, what about, so there's this other Asian association, is it pronounced ASEAN?
Yeah,
ASEAN.
ASEAN or ASEAN, yes.
ASEAN. So this is a more of a loose confederation, a loose association of countries that that border Asia, and the U.S. is a member because we have a Pacific coast, of course, and we've got, I guess, Hawaii, Alaska.
We're a member of everything. That's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Well,
that's right.
Yeah, I think that organization is more economic oriented.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a collection of countries that got together for their to promote their mutual economic interest.
Mm-hmm.
CETO would be more of a military alliance.
Okay, got it.
Which is what it was. It existed for, I don't know, 20, 25, or 30 years.
And I was just reminded of this quote when you were talking about whether Russia is a threat to Europe. And this was part of the discussion that Zelensky had in the Oval Office with Trump and J.D. Vance, where this was kind of the where things blew up, where he was trying to say, you better be glad that Ukraine is the buffer because you would be feeling the heat from Russia too, which is really quite preposterous. So Joseph Loria, Consortium News, said Western leaders ridicule Russia for taking 3 years to seize only the Donbass region of Ukraine. And yet, at the same time, they say Russia will be at the gates of Paris by summer. So which is it? Which is it? Russia is so incompetent and so weak militarily that it took them 3 years to get control of the Donbass. But, you better be careful. We better watch out because they'll be at the gates of Paris by summer. And boy, they'll be in New York within a couple years. Where you better watch it, President Trump.
Well, the foreign policy establishment has always been schizophrenic to a large degree. So, in this case, Russia's military, like that, frankly, of most of the major countries' militaries, they're not necessarily what they used to be. China, when was the last time China fought a real war? The U.S. hasn't won a real war since World War II. Though I'm sure that our military is much more capable than China's and so forth. But Russia, they were rebuilding and they've had some issues. Nonetheless, Russia could have done a full-blown mobilization had it wanted to and put more resources into this war. But even autocrats have political issues they have to deal with. There's politics at home, even in an autocracy. And to go to full-blown mobilization would have alienated the public. And so Putin chose not to do that. He's going the slow attrition route. He knows that time is on his side. The manpower issue, which has been a Ukraine problem from day one, is getting extremely acute. And so there's no incentive for Russia to, go all out anymore. Though I think it should have been a bit more aggressive. Nonetheless, what it's doing is, actually in defense of itself. No one looks at it this way, but with NATO expanding up to Russia's doorsteps, and then the U.S. essentially taking over Ukraine. How else can you see Russia's actions other than as defending itself from that? Ukraine was a territory that belonged to Russia for hundreds of years. How would the U.S. like China or Russia or whoever to do what we're doing in Ukraine in Canada or Mexico?
We'd never allow it. We wouldn't allow it for 5 minutes.
We would have never allowed what the U.S. did in Ukraine beginning in the mid-90s for some other power to do in Canada or Mexico, and or anywhere near our near periphery. And yet our attitude is we have the right to essentially wage war with Russia next door to Russia. And, it's not that kind of perspective precludes objective analysis. In other words, there is no objective analysis in the foreign policy establishment. They look at it. It's a one-way lens. They look at it one way. They don't consider the other side's perspective. And that's a prescription for war. A lot of wars have happened that way. And so, we know from the released, opened up Soviet archives that even the Soviet Union had never had any intention of invading West Germany. And look, if during the 50s, 60s, 70s, the Soviets had no intention of invading West Germany, why would at this late date Putin or Russia have any intention on invading Russia, Europe, Western Europe? You do a cost-benefit analysis. There's just no incentive there. What is there for them? There's no resources there. Why would they want it?
They have all the natural resources.
Exactly. Why would they want it? So, it makes no sense. And so that's just neocon propaganda. That if we let Russia get away with what it's doing in Ukraine, it's going to take all of Europe. It's just complete nonsense. And then the oceans thing. The Atlantic and Pacific Ocean do remain tremendous moats of protection for the U.S. And the idea that in the modern era they are no longer protection is absurd. There's only two countries that have capability of attacking the U.S. remotely. That's China and Russia with ICBM nuclear capability.
Right.
No other country can affect us. Iran has no ability to affect us. North Korea, they're working on it. They keep improving their missile capability, and
they're working on it. But every time they test one, it goes, whoo, then it goes.
Yeah, but
crashes.
I've read that they've got at least the theoretical range to hit maybe even the West Coast now. Who knows? But again, no one but China or Russia can penetrate the moats that we have, which are great in the sense of whether it's immigration or whatever. But we've allowed, Mexico to be used as a thoroughfare for all of these illegal invaders, as I call them. Nonetheless, I mean, those are a blessing. Those two ocean moats, and we
are blessed. We are blessed.
Yeah, Britain is blessed to some degree by being an island nation, but they have completely kind of obliterated that by letting in all of these migrants. But the idea that Russia is a threat today, really to anybody, other than, again, I would say it's possible Putin or Russia will move on the Baltics at some point. But if it does, it'll be because it believes it's in its security interest and it needs a buffer in the north, the way Ukraine should be, or it believes needs to be for it in the southwest there.
Well, yeah, and in some of our email discussions, I've made the point in terms of what Ukraine is. There is no country in history, a great historical nation called the Ukraine. It didn't exist. The Ukraine was a region of the Russian Empire, and going back even further, it was the actual heart of old Russia, Kiev and Rus. So a lot of Americans don't know that, and there's this Russian nationalist political leader who was the head of a minor political party for many years, Zhirinovsky. He said years ago that Ukraine, this is how Ukraine came to be a nation, was that Yeltsin, when the Soviet Union was crumbling, Yeltsin sold off the whole country for a bottle of vodka. And if you look it up, he's referring to a specific agreement that Yeltsin signed, and it was, he called it, in the middle of the night, he sold off the whole country for a bottle of vodka. Yeltsin was an alcoholic. He was a drunk, and perhaps he was drunk that night. but he signed the piece of paper in 1991 that turned what had been the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, just a region, into the nation called Ukraine, which was a huge mistake because most of that land in the Ukrainian Republic hadn't been part of the region called Ukraine. It was just kind of thrown in with the Republic, which was the point Putin tried to make in his big interview with Tucker Carlson. It didn't come off very well because he went on for too long. But all of that Donbass region was all historically Russia. It was never part of a region called Ukraine. And all those lands on the north coast of the Black Sea were never part of a region called Ukraine. Those were lands that were won by Russia in the 1700s. They took them from the Turks and opened them up to development. And Russia built those cities, the cities of Odessa and the cities in the Crimean Peninsula. So so for so many, it's so interesting for me to see so many Americans kind of falling for this idea of this great nation called Ukraine that we have to help defend. It was never that. The Ukraine was a small region. It was the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. That's what I always remember from the 90s, that the Ukraine is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and then it was the breadbasket of Russia. And then even after 1991, when it had become its own nation, it still was kind of, I remember being in Russia then in 93 and 94, and it wasn't really thought of as a separate country. I mean, Russians and Ukrainians were like this, it was a brother nation. It was, okay, it is technically its own nation, but it was like a brother country. So this whole idea that now these are two vastly different peoples who hate one another and always will seems just crazy to me. And it seems to have been the result in great part of the efforts of the United States to pull them apart and turn them against one another, because it's not natural. But do you think that real peace can be achieved, that the war can be brought to an end fairly soon here? Are you optimistic?
I am, if President Trump would, let his ego get out of the way, remove his ego from the situation. And,
Zelensky or Trump?
No, President Trump.
Okay.
Because, I think the mentality of people is, in general, it's a human nature thing that, withdrawal looks weak.
Mm.
So if we do anything where we stop what we are doing and withdraw from this situation or that situation, the perception is we're weak, when in fact our intervention and meddling is weakening us. Mm. So I think what President Trump campaigned on, America First and MAGA and all that, is consistent with terminating the funding of Ukraine, which the Ukraine war is Biden's war. I don't understand why the president would want to continue Biden's war.
Right.
The only way to terminate the war is to cut off U.S. funding. Once that happens, the end will be in sight, because the Europeans lack the wherewithal to sustain Ukraine.
But now it's cut off. But temporarily.
Well, yeah, we'll see. It was cut off because of that, White House, Zelensky nonsense. But we'll see. If now Zelensky is apparently on his knees, begging to be let back at the table. So we'll see whether they revive it. But I don't understand why President Trump cannot see that the only way to end the war is by terminating the U.S. funding. Because if you don't do that, if you continue the funding, the war continues, because Russia is not going to stop. For Russia, Ukraine is an existential threat. and
Yeah.
it's defending itself there from U.S. encroachment, and we should pull out where we shouldn't have been in the first place, and then there would have been no war without the U.S. meddling. Again, Zelensky and Putin were on the verge of an agreement. They were going to agree to avoid the war and do these things, such as Ukraine remaining neutral, agreeing to remain neutral, and so forth. And so it's just it's difficult for presidents coming into a new situation and assuming a previous president's war, as Nixon did with LBJ in Vietnam. It's difficult for them to just cut it off because they've got the whole foreign policy establishment. They're all they all drink from the same Kool-Aid fountain. It's a groupthink problem. So you go from one administration, Democrat in LBJ's case, to a new administration, Republican in Nixon's case. The advisors are more or less the same. They might have some minor political differences, but foreign policy wise, they're all the same. And so the same that was true of Trump 1. They've
got the same CIA briefers too. Right?
Yeah. The first Trump administration was just laden with neocon interventionists, and so the President Trump, as always, had good instincts, as evidenced by his rhetoric.
Incredible.
NATO is obsolete, etc. But then he was undermined by these terrible advisors that he had in the first administration. Now, hopefully, in this administration, they're much better. It appears that for the most part they are. They're unconventional people with a different mode of thinking, and that's what he needs. He needs to be encouraged. His instincts need to be encouraged. His instincts are to withdraw,
and his instincts are incredible.
Yes, he's been proved right on issue after issue, but then again, he's undermined by personnel. So, I don't know. I hope there are people in the administration that will say to him, if you keep the funding going, even just no money, but just munitions, even if it's munitions, the war is going to continue because Russia's not going to stop. So the killing will continue if the U.S. munitions continue until Ukraine runs out of men completely.
Yeah. Incredible. Rob, thank you so much. Okay, we know what needs to be done. Withdraw from NATO, cut off the funding, and everything gets better. That's the prescription. So we've got it solved. And I know we have so much more to talk about, but we're about out of time here. So we'll probably have to cut it here. But thank you so much for joining. It's great to finally see you, not in person, but on video anyway.
Right, likewise.
And it's great to have this conversation. We should do it again sometime.
Okay.
And I think I'm going to work on pulling a couple of our friends into this conversation too. They're camera shy. They don't want to do it. One, because she's got a son working in the administration in a high level position, and she's got the same name as he does. But and the other one, because he worked at the Pentagon for years. I don't know why he's shy, but I think we can work on him. We can pull him in because they're interesting and they have a different perspective, and it's all different from what you hear when you turn on the TV or even when you go online. So appreciate you so much, Rob. It's great to see you.
Okay, good to see you too. I enjoyed the chat.
Good. Have a great night.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.